The autumn wind howled across the Yorkshire moors with a ferocity that seemed to echo the loneliness dwelling within the stone walls of Whitmore Abbey. Duke Theodore Whitmore stood at the tall window of his study, watching the storm clouds gather over his vast estate, their dark shadows mirroring the perpetual gloom that had settled over his life these past 5 years. At 34, Theodore possessed the kind of commanding presence that should have made him one of England's most sought-after bachelors. Tall and powerfully built, with thick dark hair that showed premature streaks of silver at the temples and eyes the color of winter storms, he carried himself with the natural authority of a man born to rule vast holdings and influence the fate of nations. Yet for all his wealth, title, and undeniable magnetism, Theodore remained stubbornly, painfully alone. The reason was not difficult to discern for those brave enough to look closely. A jagged scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, a permanent reminder of the carriage accident that had claimed his young wife Catherine 5 years ago. But it was not merely the physical mark that kept society at bay. It was the way grief had transformed him from a charming, sociable duke into a brooding recluse who rarely left his estate and spoke to few beyond his most trusted servants. "Your Grace," came the hesitant voice of his secretary, Mr. Pemberton, from the doorway. "The morning post has arrived. There are several responses to your advertisement." Theodore turned from the window, his expression carefully neutral despite the flutter of hope in his chest. 3 months ago, in a moment of desperate loneliness, he had placed a discreet advertisement in several respectable publications, seeking correspondence with ladies of good character who might be interested in matrimony. He had been deliberately vague about his identity, signing the letters only as T.W. and providing a postbox address rather than revealing his true title or location. "How many?" he asked, settling behind his massive oak desk. "7, Your Grace. Though I should mention that 3 of them are rather forward in their expectations regarding your financial circumstances." Theodore's mouth quirked in what might have been amusement under different circumstances. "And the others?" "More circumspect. One in particular." Pemberton hesitated, then placed a letter written on simple cream paper at the top of the pile. "This one seems different. The lady writes with intelligence and genuine feeling rather than calculation." Theodore picked up the letter, noting immediately the elegant but unpretentious handwriting. The paper was good quality but not ostentatious, suggesting someone of modest means but refined taste. He opened it carefully and began to read, "Dear Mr. T.W., I confess myself somewhat surprised to be responding to such an unconventional advertisement, yet something in your words spoke to a loneliness I recognize in my own heart. You write of seeking not merely a wife, but a companion of the mind and spirit, someone who might find contentment in quiet pursuits and simple pleasures rather than the endless whirl of society. I am Miss A.B., 26 years of age, and I find myself in circumstances that make such an arrangement not merely appealing, but perhaps necessary. I have spent the last several years caring for my elderly father, and his recent passing has left me quite alone in the world. I possess no great fortune or connections, but I am well educated, even tempered, and capable of managing a household with efficiency and grace. More than these practical considerations, however, I find myself drawn to your suggestion that true partnership might be built upon mutual respect and understanding rather than passion alone. Too often, I think, we expect love to arrive like lightning, sudden and overwhelming, but perhaps the deeper, more lasting affection grows slowly, like a garden carefully tended. If you find merit in my response, I would be honored to continue our correspondence. I ask only that you be honest in your communications, as I pledge to be in mine. With sincere regards, Miss A.B." Theodore read the letter twice, then a third time, struck by the thoughtful intelligence evident in every line. Here was no grasping fortune hunter or romantic dreamer, but a woman who understood the practical realities of life while still maintaining hope for something deeper. Over the following weeks, their correspondence flourished. Theodore found himself eagerly awaiting each letter, charmed by Miss A.B.'s wit, moved by her quiet wisdom, and increasingly intrigued by the glimpses she offered of her character. She wrote of her love for literature and music, her skill in watercolors, her pleasure in simple domestic pursuits. More importantly, she revealed a strength of spirit that had carried her through loss and hardship without bitterness. In return, Theodore found himself sharing more of his true self than he had with anyone since Catherine's death. He wrote of his love for his estate, his responsibilities to his tenants, his passion for improving agricultural methods and supporting local industry. He spoke of his loneliness, though not its cause, and his hope that marriage might bring purpose and companionship back into his life. "Dear T.W., came one letter that particularly moved him. You write of feeling isolated from the world, as though you observe life from behind glass rather than truly living it. I understand this feeling more than you might imagine. Since Papa's death, I have felt similarly adrift, going through the motions of existence without truly engaging with it. Perhaps we might find in each other the courage to step back into the light." It was after 2 months of such correspondence that Theodore made his decision. In his next letter, he revealed his true identity and extended an invitation for Miss A.B. to visit Whitmore Abbey, along with several other ladies with whom he had been corresponding, for a house party that would allow them to meet in person. The response was swift and positive, though he detected a note of nervousness beneath Miss A.B.'s acceptance. She would arrive, she wrote, with only her maid for companionship, as she had no family to serve as chaperone. Theodore arranged for his housekeeper, Mrs. Hartwell, to serve as a proper companion for all the visiting ladies. Now, as he stood in his study 3 days before the house party was to begin, Theodore felt a mixture of anticipation and dread that made his stomach clench. What would these women think when they saw him? When they witnessed the scarred, brooding man he had become? Would Miss A.B., thoughtful letters and gentle understanding survive the reality of his appearance and the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to cling to Whitmore Abbey like morning mist? "Your Grace," Pemberton said, interrupting his brooding thoughts, "Mrs. Hartwell wishes to speak with you about the arrangements for the ladies' arrival." Theodore nodded, straightening his shoulders with the automatic discipline of years of ducal responsibility. Whatever happened, he would face it with dignity. He had survived far worse than the potential rejection of a few marriage-minded ladies. But as he made his way through the shadowed corridors of his ancestral home, Theodore could not quite suppress the hope that somewhere among his correspondence was a woman brave enough to see past the surface to the man beneath, a woman who might choose to stay when others fled. Arrivals and departures. The first carriage arrived at Whitmore Abbey on a grey October morning, its wheels crunching over the gravel drive as it approached the imposing facade of the ancient manor. Theodore watched from his study window as a fashionably dressed young woman emerged, took one look at the Gothic towers and gargoyle-adorned battlements, and immediately began what appeared to be an animated argument with her coachman. Within 10 minutes, she was gone, her carriage disappearing down the drive in a cloud of dust and indignation. The second arrival lasted slightly longer. Miss Penelope Fairfax, a blonde beauty of 22 with impressive connections and an even more impressive dowry, actually made it inside the house. Theodore had descended to the great hall to greet her personally, hoping that his careful grooming and finest coat might soften the impact of his scarred appearance. It did not. Miss Fairfax took one look at his face, let out a small shriek and promptly fainted into the arms of her maid. When she revived, she claimed a sudden onset of illness that required her immediate return to London. Her departure was swift and final. The third lady, Miss Charlotte Pemberton, was made of sterner stuff. She managed to maintain her composure during their introduction, accepted his offer of refreshment, and even engaged in polite conversation for nearly an hour. But Theodore could see the barely concealed horror in her eyes as she took in not just his scarred face, but the oppressive atmosphere of the abbey itself. The house was undeniably imposing, some might say forbidding. Built in the 14th century and expanded over the generations, it rose from the Yorkshire landscape like something from a Gothic novel, all dark stone and towering spires. The interior, while magnificently appointed, retained the medieval character that Theodore's ancestors had been reluctant to modernize. Tapestries depicting ancient battles hung from stone walls, suits of armor stood sentinel in shadowed alcoves, and the very air seemed heavy with the weight of centuries. Miss Pemberton lasted until evening, but Theodore was not surprised when she claimed a family emergency that required her immediate departure the following morning. By the time the fourth carriage arrived late that afternoon, Theodore had retreated to his study with a bottle of brandy and a growing certainty that his experiment in matrimony was doomed to failure. Perhaps he was meant to remain alone, a cautionary tale about the dangers of hoping for more than fate was willing to provide. The knock on his study door came as the sun was setting, painting the moors in shades of gold and crimson that did little to soften their austere beauty. "Your Grace," Mrs. Hartwell announced, "the final lady has arrived. Miss Brooks requests the honor of meeting you at your convenience." Theodore looked up from his brandy, surprised. In his correspondence, Miss A.B. had revealed her surname as Brooks, and he had been looking forward to meeting her most of all. But after the day's disasters, he had assumed she too would take one look at Whitmore Abbey and flee. "She's still here?" he asked, hardly daring to hope. "Indeed, Your Grace. She's taken tea in the blue drawing room and expressed great admiration for the library. She seems quite settled." Theodore set down his glass and straightened his cravat, trying to prepare himself for what would likely be another disappointment. But as he made his way through the corridors toward the blue drawing room, he found himself hoping against hope that Miss Brooks might prove different from her predecessors. The blue drawing room was one of the Abbey's more welcoming spaces, with large windows that looked out over the gardens and furnishings that had been updated within the last century. As Theodore entered, he saw a figure silhouetted against the window, and for a moment, his breath caught. Miss Amelia Brooks was not a conventional beauty, but there was something arresting about her that made Theodore pause in the doorway. She was tall and graceful, with rich auburn hair that caught the firelight and intelligent hazel eyes that met his directly without flinching. Her dress was simple but well made, suggesting modest circumstances but excellent taste. What struck him most, however, was her composure. Unlike the other ladies, she showed no shock at his appearance, no barely concealed revulsion at his scars. Instead, she studied his face with the same thoughtful attention she might give to a painting in a gallery, as if she were seeing not just the surface but something deeper beneath. "Your Grace," she said, offering a curtsy that was perfectly correct without being obsequious, "I am honored to finally meet you in person. Your letters did not exaggerate the beauty of your estate." "Miss Brooks," Theodore replied, moving further into the room, "I confess myself surprised to find you still here. The other ladies found Whitmore Abbey overwhelming." A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "I imagine they did. It's certainly not what one expects from the typical country house, but I find myself rather charmed by its authenticity. So many great houses have been modernized beyond recognition, but yours retains the character of its history." Theodore felt a flutter of something he had not experienced in years, genuine interest from someone who seemed to see him as more than a collection of scars and shadows. "You're not disturbed by its Gothic nature. On the contrary, I find it fascinating. The craftsmanship in those stone carvings must have taken decades to complete, and the library, I hope you don't mind that Mrs. Hartwell gave me a brief tour, is absolutely magnificent. I've never seen such a collection outside of Oxford." As they settled into chairs by the fire, Theodore found himself relaxing for the first time all day. Miss Brooks, Amelia, as he found himself thinking of her, possessed the same thoughtful intelligence that had attracted him to her letters, but in person she also radiated a quiet strength that was deeply appealing. "I must ask," he said, as Mrs. Hartwell served tea, "are you not concerned by the circumstances of our meeting? Most ladies would find the entire arrangement rather irregular." Amelia considered this as she stirred her tea. "Perhaps, but I found that conventional approaches don't always serve those of us in unconventional circumstances. You sought a wife through letters because traditional courtship had failed you. I responded because traditional opportunities had failed me. Sometimes irregular situations require irregular solutions. And you're not disturbed by my appearance?" The question came out more bluntly than Theodore had intended, but he needed to know. Amelia's gaze moved to his scar, studying it without flinching. "You were injured," she said simply. "Badly, I would guess, and recently enough that it still causes you pain, not physical perhaps, but emotional. I'm sorry for whatever caused it." The simple compassion in her voice nearly undid him. "My wife," he said quietly, "she died in the carriage accident that gave me this scar 5 years ago." "I'm very sorry for your loss," Amelia said, and Theodore could hear the genuine sympathy in her voice. "Grief changes us, doesn't it? Sometimes in ways that are visible, sometimes in ways that are not. You speak as if you know something of grief yourself." "I do. My father's death was difficult. He suffered for many months before the end, and I watched him fade away piece by piece. It leaves marks on the soul, even when they don't show on the skin." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the fire crackling between them, and the wind howling around the ancient stones of the abbey. Theodore found himself studying Amelia's profile, noting the determined set of her chin, and the way her hands remained steady, despite what must be a nerve-wracking situation. "Why did you stay?" he asked finally. "When the others fled, why did you remain?" Amelia turned to meet his gaze directly. "Because I came here to meet the man who wrote those letters. Thoughtful, intelligent, lonely letters that spoke to something in my own heart. That man doesn't disappear simply because he bears scars or lives in a house that others find intimidating. And if I told you that the man who wrote those letters was perhaps more hopeful than the reality, that grief and isolation have made me difficult to live with, then I would say that grief is not a permanent condition and isolation is a choice that can be changed. I would say that the man who wrote to me about improving conditions for his tenants and supporting local industry is still there, perhaps buried under pain but not destroyed by it. Theodore felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the tight bands of loneliness that had constricted his heart for so long. You have a remarkable capacity for optimism, Miss Brooks. Not optimism, Your Grace, hope. They're different things. Optimism expects the best outcome, hope works toward it. Hope. As the evening progressed, Theodore found himself more and more drawn to this remarkable woman who had chosen to stay when others fled. She was intelligent without being pedantic, compassionate without being weak, and possessed of a quiet strength that he found deeply attractive. When it came time to retire for the evening, Theodore found himself reluctant to end their conversation. "Miss Brooks," he said as she rose to leave, would you care to see more of the estate tomorrow? The grounds are quite extensive, and the views from the North Tower are said to be spectacular." "I would be honored, Your Grace," Amelia replied with a smile that transformed her entire face. "I look forward to it." As Theodore watched her leave, he felt something he had not experienced in 5 long years. The possibility that his future might hold more than mere existence. Perhaps, just perhaps, he had found someone brave enough to see past the scars to the man beneath, someone who might choose to stay not out of obligation or desperation, but out of something deeper and more lasting. For the first time since Catherine's death, Duke Theodore Whitmore allowed himself to hope. The Gardens of Understanding. The morning dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of golden autumn light that transformed even the most forbidding landscape into something approaching beauty. Theodore had risen early, as was his custom, but instead of his usual solitary breakfast in his study, he found himself taking extra care with his appearance and making his way to the morning room where Amelia would be taking her meal. He paused outside the door, suddenly uncertain. What if yesterday's easy conversation had been a fluke? What if, in the harsh light of morning, she had reconsidered her decision to stay? The other ladies had all found excuses to leave. Perhaps Amelia would prove no different. But when he entered the morning room, he found her seated by the window with a cup of tea and what appeared to be a letter she was writing. She looked up at his approach with a smile that seemed genuinely pleased to see him. "Good morning, Your Grace. I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in some time," Theodore replied honestly, taking the seat across from her. "And you? I trust your accommodations were satisfactory." "More than satisfactory. The blue chamber is lovely, and the view of the gardens is spectacular. I spent quite some time last evening watching the mist rise from the moors. There's something almost mystical about this place." Theodore felt a surge of pleasure at her words. So few people appreciated the wild beauty of Yorkshire, preferring the tame landscapes of southern England. "You're not put off by the isolation." "On the contrary, I find it peaceful. After years of caring for an invalid, the quiet is rather welcome." Amelia set down her teacup and regarded him thoughtfully. "May I ask you something, Your Grace?" "Of course." "In your letters you wrote beautifully about your estate and your responsibilities to your tenants, but you never mentioned the Abbey's history. Surely a house this ancient has stories to tell." Theodore's expression grew thoughtful. "Indeed it does. Some of them quite dark, I'm afraid. The Abbey was built on the site of a medieval monastery that was dissolved under Henry VIII. The first Duke of Whitmore was granted the lands for his loyalty to the crown, but local legend says the monks cursed the property before they were driven out." "And do you believe in curses?" Amelia asked, her tone suggesting genuine curiosity rather than mockery. "I didn't used to," Theodore said quietly, "but sometimes it seems as though happiness has a difficult time taking root here. My parents died young. My brother was killed at Waterloo. My wife—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Perhaps," Amelia said gently, "it's not a curse but simply a run of bad fortune, and perhaps it's time for that fortune to change." There was something in her voice, a quiet conviction that made Theodore look at her more closely. She met his gaze steadily, and he saw in her hazel eyes a strength that went deeper than mere optimism. "Would you like to see the gardens?" he asked impulsively. "The formal gardens are rather overgrown, but there's a wilderness area that I think you might find interesting." "I would love that," Amelia replied, rising gracefully from her chair. As they made their way through the Abbey's corridors, Theodore found himself seeing his ancestral home through Amelia's eyes. Where he had grown accustomed to the oppressive weight of centuries, she seemed to see beauty in the ancient stonework and craftsmanship. She paused to admire a particularly fine piece of medieval carving, asked intelligent questions about the portraits lining the gallery, and showed genuine interest in the history he had always taken for granted. The gardens, when they reached them, were indeed overgrown. What had once been formal parterres were now wild tangles of roses and ivy, while the topiary had grown into fantastic, unrecognizable shapes. But instead of being dismayed by the neglect, Amelia seemed charmed by the romantic decay. "It's like something from a fairy tale," she said, pausing beside a crumbling fountain where water still trickled from the mouth of a moss-covered cherub. "Wild and beautiful and slightly melancholy. It wasn't always like this," Theodore said, feeling compelled to explain. Before Catherine died, she loved these gardens. She had plans to restore them, to bring them back to their former glory. After the accident, I couldn't bear to continue the work. Amelia was quiet for a moment, studying the overgrown beds with thoughtful eyes. "May I ask what she was like, your wife?" The question caught Theodore off guard. Most people avoided mentioning Catherine, as if her very existence were somehow inappropriate to acknowledge. But there was nothing prurient in Amelia's curiosity, only a gentle desire to understand. "She was light," he said finally. "Everything about her was bright and warm, and full of joy. She could make anyone laugh, could find beauty in the smallest things. The Abbey was different when she lived here, warmer, more welcoming. She had a way of making even the most forbidding spaces feel like home." "She sounds wonderful," Amelia said simply. "You must miss her terribly." "I do," Theodore admitted. "But perhaps it's time I stopped trying to preserve everything exactly as she left it. Perhaps she would want me to move forward rather than remain frozen in grief." They walked on in comfortable silence, following overgrown paths that led deeper into the wilderness area of the estate. Here, nature had been allowed to take its course, creating a landscape that was wild but not chaotic, beautiful in its untamed state. "This is magnificent," Amelia breathed as they emerged onto a small hill that overlooked the entire valley. "You can see for miles." "On a clear day you can see all the way to the Pennines," Theodore said, moving to stand beside her. "Catherine used to say it was like standing at the edge of the world." "I can see why she loved it here," Amelia said softly. "There's something about this place, despite its melancholy, or perhaps because of it, that speaks to the soul." Theodore turned to study her profile as she gazed out over the landscape. The wind had loosened several strands of her auburn hair, and her cheeks were flushed with the cool air and exercise. She looked, he thought, as though she belonged here, as though the wild beauty of Yorkshire suited her in a way that drawing rooms and ballrooms never could. "Miss Brooks," he said impulsively, "may I ask you something personal?" "Of course. In your letters you mentioned that your circumstances had changed after your father's death. May I ask, what are your plans if this arrangement doesn't work out? Do you have family to return to?" Amelia was quiet for so long that Theodore began to regret the question. But finally she spoke, her voice steady despite the gravity of her words. "I have no family left, Your Grace. My father was a country rector with a small living, and what little he left was consumed by his medical expenses and debts. I have perhaps £50 to my name, and no prospects beyond seeking employment as a governess or companion." The stark honesty of her admission hit Theodore like a physical blow. Here was a woman of obvious intelligence and refinement, reduced to near poverty by circumstances beyond her control, yet she spoke of her situation without self-pity or bitterness, merely as a fact to be dealt with. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I shouldn't have pried." "You have every right to know," Amelia replied, turning to face him directly. "If we are to consider marriage, there should be honesty between us. I won't pretend to feelings I don't have, and I won't hide the practical realities of my situation. I need security, Your Grace. I need a home and a purpose. But I hope, I pray, that I might also find something deeper. And what would that be? Companionship, mutual respect, perhaps in time, affection. I don't expect love. I know that your heart was given to another, and I would never presume to compete with such a memory. But I hope we might find contentment together, and perhaps even happiness." Theodore felt something shift in his chest at her words, a loosening of the tight grip he had maintained on his heart for 5 long years. Here was a woman who understood loss, who asked for nothing more than he might reasonably give, yet who offered something he had thought lost forever, the possibility of companionship without demands, understanding without judgment. "Miss Brooks," he said carefully, If I were to ask you to stay, not just for the remainder of this visit, but permanently, what would your answer be? Amelia studied his face for a long moment, her hazel eyes searching his expression, as if trying to read his very soul. I would ask you to be certain of what you're offering, Your Grace. Marriage is not something to be entered into lightly, particularly when one party is still grieving a great loss. I am grieving, Theodore admitted. I may always grieve Catherine's loss to some degree, but I'm also lonely, Miss Brooks. Desperately, achingly lonely, and I hope that you might be lonely too. I am, she said simply. Then perhaps we might be lonely together, and in time, find that loneliness transformed into something warmer. Amelia was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving from his face to the wild landscape spread out below them. When she spoke, her voice was soft but certain. Yes, she said, yes, Your Grace, I will stay. Theodore felt a surge of relief so profound it nearly brought him to his knees. Without thinking, he reached for her hand, and she allowed him to take it, her fingers warm and steady in his grasp. Theodore, he said quietly, when we're alone, I would like you to call me Theodore. Theodore, she repeated, and he found he liked the sound of his name on her lips. And you must call me Amelia. As they stood there on the hill overlooking his estate, hands clasped and futures intertwined, Theodore felt something he had not experienced in 5 long years, hope for tomorrow. Perhaps the curse of Whitmore Abbey was finally broken. Perhaps it was time for happiness to take root in the ancient stones and wild gardens of his ancestral home. And perhaps, just perhaps, he had found in Amelia Brooks not a replacement for what he had lost, but something entirely new, a partnership built on understanding, respect, and the quiet courage to choose hope over despair. The proposal. The days that followed Amelia's decision to stay passed with a swiftness that surprised Theodore. What he had expected to be an awkward period of formal courtship instead became a time of genuine discovery, as he and Amelia settled into a routine that felt remarkably natural. Each morning, they would breakfast together in the morning room, their conversation ranging from estate matters to literature, to their shared observations about the changing season. Amelia proved to be an excellent listener, asking thoughtful questions about the challenges facing his tenants and offering insights that revealed both her intelligence and her compassionate nature. In the afternoons, they would walk the grounds together, and Theodore found himself seeing his estate through her eyes, not as a burden of responsibility or a monument to past glories, but as a living entity with its own beauty and potential. Amelia had a gift for finding wonder in unexpected places, the way light filtered through the ancient windows of the Abbey's chapel, the intricate carvings on a forgotten garden gate, the view from a crumbling tower that had stood empty for decades. You see things differently than most people, Theodore observed one afternoon as they explored the ruins of the original monastery that lay hidden in a grove of oak trees. How so? Amelia asked, running her fingers along the weathered stone of what had once been an altar. You look for beauty where others see only decay, hope where others see only loss. Amelia considered this, her expression thoughtful. Perhaps it's because I've learned that nothing is ever truly lost, only transformed. These stones may no longer form a functioning monastery, but they're still beautiful, still meaningful. They tell a story of faith and dedication that transcends their current state. And you think the same principle applies to people, don't you? She turned to face him, her hazel eyes serious. You're not the same man you were before your wife's death. Grief has changed you, marked you in ways both visible and invisible. But that doesn't mean you're broken beyond repair. It means you're different, perhaps deeper, certainly more aware of life's fragility and preciousness. Theodore felt something tighten in his chest at her words. Some would say I'm damaged goods, Miss Brooks. A man too scarred by loss to be a proper husband. Then they would be fools, Amelia said with quiet conviction. Scars are proof of survival, Theodore. They show that you've endured something terrible and lived to tell the tale. That's not weakness, it's strength. As the week progressed, Theodore found himself increasingly drawn to this remarkable woman who had chosen to stay when others fled. She was not Catherine, would never be Catherine, but she was something else entirely, a companion who understood loss without being consumed by it, who offered comfort without demanding anything in return. It was on their 7th evening together that Theodore made his decision. They had dined quietly in the small dining room, their conversation easy and comfortable, and afterward had retired to the library where Amelia had discovered a first edition of Pride and Prejudice that had belonged to his mother. She would have liked you, Theodore said, watching as Amelia carefully turned the pages of the beloved novel. Your mother? Yes, she had your same appreciation for literature. Your same ability to find joy in simple pleasures. She would have approved of my choice. Amelia looked up from the book, her expression suddenly serious. Your choice. Theodore rose from his chair and moved to the fireplace, needing the distance to gather his courage for what he was about to say. Amelia, these past days have been revelatory. I came into this arrangement hoping to find a suitable wife, someone who could manage my household, and perhaps provide companionship. What I found instead is something I didn't dare hope for, which is a partner, someone who sees me, truly sees me, and chooses to stay anyway. Someone who looks at this dark, brooding house and finds beauty in its shadows. Someone who listens to my concerns about crop rotation and tenant housing with genuine interest rather than polite tolerance. Amelia set the book aside and rose to face him. Theodore, what are you saying? I'm saying that I would like to ask you to marry me, not out of convenience or necessity, but because I believe we could build something good together, something real and lasting and worthy of the vows we would make. For a moment Amelia was silent, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. Are you certain? This is not a decision to be made lightly, and I want to be sure you're not simply grateful for my acceptance of your circumstances. I am grateful, Theodore admitted, moving closer to her. But gratitude is not what makes my heart race when you smile, or what makes me look forward to each morning because I know I'll see you at breakfast. Gratitude is not what makes me want to share every thought, every concern, every small pleasure with you. Then what is it? Amelia asked softly. Theodore reached for her hands, relieved when she didn't pull away. I think it might be love, Amelia. Not the same love I felt for Catherine. That was the love of youth, passionate and consuming. This is something different, deeper perhaps. The love of a man who has known loss and found someone worth risking his heart for again. Tears gathered in Amelia's eyes at his words. Theodore, I care for you deeply, more deeply than I expected when I came here. But I need you to be certain that you're ready for this, ready to let go of the past enough to embrace a future. I am, Theodore said with quiet conviction. Catherine will always be part of my history, but she doesn't have to define my future. You've shown me that it's possible to honor the past while still moving forward, to carry love without being crushed by its weight. Amelia studied his face for a long moment, searching for any sign of doubt or reservation. What she saw there must have satisfied her, because she smiled, a radiant expression that transformed her entire countenance. Then yes, Theodore, yes, I will marry you. The kiss that followed was gentle at first, tentative, as if they were both afraid of breaking the spell that had brought them to this moment. But as Amelia responded, her arms coming up to circle his neck, Theodore felt the last of his reservations melt away. This was right. This was what he wanted, what he needed, what he had been searching for without even knowing it. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Theodore rested his forehead against hers. I want to do this properly, he said. Banns, a proper wedding, all the ceremony you deserve, but I also want to marry you as soon as possible. I've wasted too many years already. Then we'll do both, Amelia said with a laugh that was pure joy. A proper courtship and a swift wedding, the best of both worlds. The neighbors will talk, Theodore warned. A reclusive duke suddenly marrying a woman of modest means after a week's acquaintance, it will cause quite a stir. Let them talk, Amelia said firmly. We know the truth of what we've found together. That's all that matters. As they stood there in the firelight, holding each other and planning their future, Theodore felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for Amelia's presence in his life, but for the courage she had given him to hope again. The curse of Whitmore Abbey, if it had ever truly existed, was finally broken, and in its place was something far more powerful. The promise of love rebuilt from the ashes of loss, stronger and more precious for having been hard won. The transformation. In the weeks that followed their engagement, Whitmore Abbey underwent a transformation that amazed everyone who witnessed it. The change was not merely physical, though Amelia did indeed begin the careful restoration of Catherine's beloved gardens, but rather a fundamental shift in the very atmosphere of the ancient house. Where once there had been oppressive silence, now there was the sound of laughter echoing through the corridors. Where shadows had lingered in corners, now fires burned brightly in hearths that had stood cold for years. The servants, who had grown accustomed to moving through their duties with funeral solemnity, began to smile again as they went about their work. It's like watching the house come back to life, Mrs. Hartwell confided to Mr. Pemberton one morning as they observed Amelia directing the cleaning of the long-closed music room. His Grace is a different man entirely. Indeed, Theodore seemed to have shed years along with his perpetual gloom. He smiled more readily, spoke with greater warmth to his staff, and had even begun entertaining visitors again, something he had not done since Catherine's death. The transformation was so marked that several of his neighbours, who had grown accustomed to his hermit-like existence, made special trips to Whitmore Abbey simply to witness the change for themselves. "Remarkable," declared Lord Pemberton, the local magistrate, after dining with the newly engaged couple. "I had begun to fear that our dear Theodore was lost to us forever." "Miss Brooks has worked a miracle," but Amelia herself would have disputed such praise. She knew that the change in Theodore came not from any magic she possessed, but from his own courage in choosing to live again, rather than merely exist. Her role had been simply to provide a reason for that choice, to be someone worth emerging from the shadows for. The wedding preparations proceeded with the efficiency that reflected Amelia's practical nature and Theodore's eagerness to make her officially his wife. They had decided on a small ceremony in the Abbey's ancient chapel, with only close neighbours and estate staff in attendance. Amelia had no family to invite, a fact that saddened Theodore more than it did her. "I've grown accustomed to being alone," she told him one evening, as they walked through the restored gardens, admiring the progress that had been made. "Having you, having this place, having a future to look forward to, it's more than I ever dared hope for." "You'll never be alone again," Theodore promised, stopping to face her among the newly planted rose bushes. "Whatever happens, whatever challenges we face, we'll face them together." The sincerity in his voice made Amelia's heart flutter with the same mixture of love and gratitude that had become her constant companion since accepting his proposal. She had come to Whitmore Abbey expecting nothing more than a practical arrangement, perhaps a marriage of convenience, that would provide her with security in exchange for her domestic skills. Instead, she had found something far more precious, a man who saw her true worth, who valued her mind as much as her companionship, and who had given her a home in every sense of the word. "Theodore," she said softly, reaching up to touch the scar that marked his left cheek, "do you ever regret it? The advertisement, I mean. The risk you took in seeking a wife through letters?" "Never," he replied without hesitation, covering her hand with his own. "It brought me you. How could I regret the best decision I've ever made?" As they continued their evening walk, they discussed the final details of their wedding ceremony and their plans for the future. Theodore had been consulting with his steward about improvements to the tenant cottages, a project that Amelia had enthusiastically supported. She had also expressed interest in establishing a small school for the children of the estate workers, an idea that had never occurred to Theodore, but which he immediately embraced. "You have a gift for seeing possibilities where others see only problems," he observed, as they paused beside the restored fountain that now sparkled in the moonlight. "It's one of the many things I love about you. And you have a gift for making those possibilities into reality," Amelia replied. "Together I think we can accomplish wonderful things." The night before their wedding, as Amelia sat in her chamber putting the finishing touches on the simple white dress she had chosen for the ceremony, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago she had been a grieving daughter with no prospects and no hope for the future. Tomorrow she would become the Duchess of Whitmore, mistress of one of Yorkshire's greatest estates, and wife to a man who had somehow learned to love again despite the wounds that had nearly destroyed him. A soft knock at her door interrupted her reverie, and she looked up to see Mrs. Hartwell entering with a small wrapped package. "From His Grace," the housekeeper said with a smile. "He asked me to give this to you tonight, with his compliments and his love." Amelia unwrapped the package carefully, gasping when she revealed its contents. Inside was a delicate necklace of pearls and sapphires, clearly an antique piece of extraordinary beauty and value. "It belonged to the first Duchess of Whitmore," Mrs. Hartwell explained. "His Grace thought you should wear it tomorrow to connect you to the history of the family you're joining." Tears gathered in Amelia's eyes at the thoughtfulness of the gesture. Theodore had given her many gifts during their courtship, books, flowers from the garden, small tokens of his affection, but this was different. This was a symbol of acceptance, of belonging, of her place in the long history of Whitmore Abbey. "Tell His Grace," she said softly, "that I am honoured beyond words, and that I will wear it with pride." As Mrs. Hartwell helped her fasten the necklace around her throat, Amelia caught sight of herself in the mirror and was startled by what she saw. The woman looking back at her was not the frightened, desperate spinster who had responded to an advertisement in a moment of desperation. This woman was confident, loved, and ready to embrace whatever the future might bring. Tomorrow she would marry Theodore Whitmore and become a duchess. But more importantly, she would join her life to that of a man who had taught her that love could indeed be found in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the greatest treasures were discovered by those brave enough to stay when others chose to flee. The wedding. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything seem sharp and new. Theodore had risen before dawn, unable to sleep for the anticipation that coursed through his veins like wine. Today he would marry Amelia Brooks and make her his duchess, his partner, his companion for whatever years remained to them. As he stood before his mirror, adjusting his cravat for the third time, Theodore caught sight of his reflection and was struck by how much he had changed in the weeks since Amelia's arrival. The haunted look that had shadowed his eyes for 5 years was gone, replaced by something that looked remarkably like happiness. Even his scar seemed less prominent somehow, no longer the defining feature of his face, but simply part of the story that had led him to this moment. "Your Grace," came Pemberton's voice from the doorway, "the guests have begun to arrive. Lord Pemberton and his family, the Ashfords, several of the tenant families, quite a respectable gathering considering the short notice." Theodore nodded, feeling a flutter of nervousness that surprised him. He had been married before, after all, yet this felt entirely different. His marriage to Catherine had been the natural culmination of a childhood attachment, expected by both families and society. This marriage to Amelia was a choice made in full knowledge of life's complexities, a deliberate decision to build something new from the ruins of the past. "And Miss Brooks?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "Radiant, Your Grace. Mrs. Hartwell reports that she slept well and ate a good breakfast. She seems quite calm, all things considered." Theodore smiled at this. Of course Amelia would be calm. She faced everything with that same steady composure that had first attracted him to her letters. It was one of the qualities he most admired about her, her ability to meet whatever life presented with grace and determination. The chapel of Whitmore Abbey had been built in the 13th century and had witnessed countless ceremonies over the intervening centuries. Today, it glowed with the warm light of dozens of candles, their flames reflecting off the ancient stained glass windows and casting rainbow patterns across the stone floor. The pews, usually empty except for the occasional solitary service, were filled with neighbors and tenants who had come to witness their duke's return to happiness. Theodore took his place at the altar, his hands clasped behind his back to hide their slight tremor. Beside him stood his closest friend, Lord Ashford, who had travelled from London specifically to serve as his groomsman. The two men had known each other since their school days, and Ashford had been one of the few people to maintain contact with Theodore during his years of self-imposed isolation. "Nervous?" Ashford murmured, noting Theodore's tension. "Terrified," Theodore admitted quietly. "What if I'm not ready for this? What if I can't be the husband she deserves?" "My dear fellow," Ashford replied with a gentle smile, "the fact that you're asking those questions proves that you are ready. The Theodore I knew 5 years ago would never have questioned his own worthiness. He was too arrogant for such introspection. The man standing here today has been humbled by loss and made wise by suffering. Miss Brooks is getting the better bargain, I assure you." Before Theodore could respond, the chapel organ began to play, its rich tones filling the ancient space with music that seemed to resonate in his very bones. The congregation rose as one, turning toward the back of the chapel where Amelia would make her entrance. When she appeared in the doorway, Theodore felt his breath catch in his throat. She wore a gown of ivory silk that had belonged to his mother, altered to fit her taller frame, but retaining its elegant simplicity. The pearl and sapphire necklace he had given her the night before glowed at her throat, and her auburn hair was arranged in a style that was both fashionable and timeless. But it was her expression that truly took his breath away, the radiant joy that lit her face as their eyes met across the length of the chapel. She walked toward him with steady steps, her head held high and her gaze never wavering from his face. She had no father to give her away, no family to support her in this moment, yet she moved with a confidence that spoke of her certainty in the choice she was making. When she reached his side, Theodore offered her his arm, and she took it with a smile that made his heart race. "You're beautiful," he whispered, meant for her ears alone. "As are you," she replied softly, her eyes taking in his formal dress and the way the morning light caught the silver in his dark hair. The ceremony itself was conducted by the elderly rector who had served the parish for nearly 4 decades. His voice, weathered by age but still strong, carried easily through the chapel as he spoke of love and commitment, of the courage required to join 2 lives into one, and of the blessing that came to those who chose hope over fear. When it came time for the vows, Theodore spoke his with a conviction that surprised even him. I, Theodore, take thee, Amelia, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part. Amelia's response was equally heartfelt, her voice clear and steady as she pledged herself to him, with words that had been spoken in this same chapel for centuries. When they exchanged rings, simple gold bands that Theodore had commissioned from the village goldsmith, he felt a sense of completion that he had not experienced since Catherine's death. "You may kiss your bride," the rector announced with a smile, and Theodore needed no further encouragement. The kiss was gentle but sure, a promise of all the tenderness and passion that lay ahead. When they broke apart, both were smiling, and the congregation erupted in applause and cheers that echoed off the ancient stone walls. As they walked back down the aisle together, now husband and wife, Theodore caught sight of the faces around them, tenants and neighbors, servants and friends, all beaming with genuine happiness for their duke's newfound joy. Mrs. Hartwell was openly weeping with delight, while several of the tenant farmers were grinning broadly as they applauded. The wedding breakfast that followed was held in the great hall, which had been decorated with autumn flowers and greenery from the estate. The meal was simple but elegant, featuring the best of local produce and wines from the abbey's cellars. Theodore had insisted on inviting all the estate workers and their families, wanting to share his happiness with those who had remained loyal during his darkest years. "A toast," declared Lord Ashford, rising from his seat with a glass of champagne, "to the Duke and Duchess of Whitmore. May their union bring joy to these ancient halls and happiness to all who dwell within them." The toast was echoed enthusiastically by all present, and Theodore felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the wine. For the first time in years, Whitmore Abbey felt like a home rather than a mausoleum, filled with life and laughter and the promise of better days to come. As the afternoon wore on and the guests gradually departed, Theodore and Amelia found themselves alone in the drawing room, still in their wedding finery, but finally able to speak privately as husband and wife. "How do you feel, Your Grace?" Theodore asked with a smile, using her new title for the first time. "Overwhelmed," Amelia admitted with a laugh. "A duchess! 6 weeks ago I was a penniless spinster with no prospects. Now I'm married to the most wonderful man in England and mistress of one of the finest estates in Yorkshire. It seems like something from a dream." "If it's a dream, then I hope never to wake," Theodore said, moving to sit beside her on the sofa. "Amelia, I want you to know that I meant every word I spoke today. I love you, not as a replacement for what I've lost, but as something entirely new and precious." "I love you too," Amelia replied, her voice soft with emotion. "I didn't expect it to happen so quickly or so completely, but you've become essential to my happiness, Theodore, essential to who I am." As the sun set over the Yorkshire moors, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the new Duke and Duchess of Whitmore sat together in comfortable silence, hands intertwined and hearts full of hope for the future. The curse of Whitmore Abbey, if it had ever truly existed, was finally and completely broken. In its place was something far more powerful, a love built on understanding, strengthened by shared loss, and blessed with the promise of years to come. Theodore had sought a wife through letters, expecting little more than companionship and practical partnership. Instead, he had found his salvation in a woman brave enough to stay when others fled, wise enough to see past his scars to the man beneath, and loving enough to help him build a new life from the ashes of the old. 2 years later, the nursery at Whitmore Abbey was filled with the soft morning light that streamed through windows overlooking the restored gardens. Amelia sat in the rocking chair that Theodore had commissioned from the village carpenter, cradling their 6-month-old son, James, as he dozed contentedly after his morning feeding. The transformation of the abbey was now complete, both physically and spiritually. What had once been a monument to grief and isolation had become a thriving family home, filled with warmth, laughter, and the promise of future generations. The gardens bloomed with renewed vigor, the staff moved through their duties with smiles and purpose, and visitors were once again welcomed with genuine hospitality. "There you are," Theodore said softly from the doorway, his voice warm with the contentment that had become his natural state. "I was wondering where my 2 favorite people had disappeared to." "He was fussy after breakfast," Amelia explained, looking up at her husband with the smile that never failed to make his heart race. "I think he's finally settling down for his morning nap." Theodore moved into the room, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet as he approached his wife and son. At 36, He looked younger than he had at 34, the lines of grief and isolation smoothed away by happiness and purpose. The scar still marked his face, but it had become simply part of who he was rather than a badge of suffering. "The architect sent word about the new wing," he said, settling into the chair beside Amelia's. "Construction should be complete by Christmas. We'll have plenty of room for visiting family and future additions to our own." Amelia's eyes sparkled with mischief. "Future additions, are you suggesting something, Your Grace?" Theodore's grin was answer enough, and Amelia felt her cheeks warm with the familiar flutter of attraction that still surprised her with its intensity. Their marriage had proven to be everything she had hoped for, and more, a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine affection that had deepened into profound love. "Mrs. Hartwell mentioned that we've received another letter from someone responding to our situation," Theodore said, his tone carefully neutral. Over the past year, word had spread throughout England about the Duke of Whitmore's unconventional courtship and marriage. The story of how he had found love through correspondence had captured the public imagination, and they had begun receiving letters from other lonely souls seeking advice or hoping to replicate their success. "What does this one say?" Amelia asked, adjusting baby James in her arms as he stirred slightly. "A young widow in Devon, left with 3 small children and no means of support. She's heard our story and wonders if we might know of any gentleman who might be interested in a practical arrangement." Amelia's expression grew thoughtful. "Actually, I might. Lord Pemberton mentioned that his nephew in Cornwall has been looking for a wife, someone who could help him manage his estate and care for his elderly mother. He's not interested in a society marriage, just someone sensible and kind. Shall I write to him?" "Please do. And perhaps we should invite them both here for a visit. Sometimes people need to see that happiness is possible before they can believe it for themselves." It had become something of a mission for them, this informal matchmaking that had grown out of their own experience. They had already facilitated 3 successful marriages between people who might never have found each other through conventional means, and the gratitude of these couples had become one of their greatest joys. "You know," Theodore mused, watching as Amelia gently rocked their son, "I sometimes wonder what would have happened if you had been one of the ladies who fled that first day." "But I wasn't," Amelia replied simply. "I stayed because something told me that the man who wrote those letters was worth knowing, worth fighting for, and I was right. What if you hadn't been? What if I had proven to be everything you feared? Bitter, damaged beyond repair, impossible to live with?" Amelia considered this seriously. "Then I would have tried to help you heal, and if that failed I would have left with dignity and no regrets. But I never doubted that you were fundamentally a good man, Theodore. Wounded, yes, but not broken. There's a difference." Baby James chose that moment to wake fully, his blue eyes, so like his father's, focusing on Theodore's face with the intense concentration that babies brought to studying the world around them. Theodore reached out to stroke his son's soft cheek, marveling as he always did at the miracle of this small life they had created together. "He's going to be handsome like his father," Amelia observed with maternal pride. "And intelligent like his mother," Theodore countered. "The perfect combination." A knock at the nursery door interrupted their domestic tranquility, and Mrs. Hartwell appeared with her usual efficient smile. "Your Graces, forgive the interruption, but you have visitors. Lord and Lady Ashford have arrived from London, and they've brought someone they're eager for you to meet." Theodore and Amelia exchanged glances. The Ashfords were among their closest friends, but they hadn't been expecting a visit. "Did they say who they've brought?" Theodore asked. "A young lady, Your Grace. Lady Ashford mentioned something about another success story that they thought you'd find interesting." Amelia rose carefully, settling James in his cradle where he could continue his nap undisturbed. "Shall we go see what they're so excited about?" They made their way downstairs to the drawing room, where they found the Ashfords seated with a young woman of perhaps 25. She was pretty in a quiet way, with dark hair and intelligent brown eyes, but there was something about her posture that suggested recent hardship. "Theodore, Amelia!" Lady Ashford exclaimed, rising to embrace them both. "We've brought someone we simply had to introduce to you. This is Miss Sarah Whitfield, and she has the most remarkable story." Miss Whitfield rose and curtsied gracefully, though Amelia noticed the slight tremor in her hands that suggested nervousness. "Your Graces, I'm honored to meet you. Lord and Lady Ashford have told me so much about your unique courtship." "Please sit," Amelia said warmly, settling herself across from their guest. "We're always interested in meeting new friends." "Lady Ashford, you said Miss Whitfield has a story." "Indeed she does," Lady Ashford replied, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Sarah, tell them about your correspondence with Mr. Harrison." Miss Whitfield's cheeks coloured slightly, but she spoke with quiet dignity. I responded to an advertisement much like yours, Your Grace. A gentleman seeking a wife through letters, someone who valued character over fortune. We corresponded for several months, and I found myself quite attached to his words, his thoughts. And, Theodore prompted gently, when we finally met, I discovered that Mr. Harrison was not quite what I had expected. He was older than he had indicated, and his circumstances were different. But by then I had come to care for the man behind the letters, regardless of his appearance or situation. How different? Amelia asked, sensing there was more to the story. Miss Whitfield took a deep breath. Mr. Harrison lost his leg in the war, Your Grace. He walks with a crutch and believed that no woman would want him as he is. But I found that his courage in the face of adversity, his kindness to his servants and tenants, his intelligence and humor, these things mattered far more than his physical limitations. Theodore felt a familiar tightness in his chest at the parallel to his own story. And you married him? 3 weeks ago, Miss Whitfield replied, her face lighting up with happiness. We're on our wedding trip, and he insisted we stop here to meet the couple who gave him hope that love was still possible. Where is Mr. Harrison now? Amelia asked. Examining your stables with your head groom, Lord Ashford interjected with a chuckle. He's quite passionate about horses despite, or perhaps because of, his injury. He's developed some innovative methods for training that accommodate his limitations. As if summoned by their conversation, the drawing-room door opened to admit a man of perhaps 40, walking with the aid of an elegant walking stick. He was tall and distinguished, with greying hair and kind eyes that immediately sought out Miss Whitfield, now Mrs. Harrison. My dear, he said to his wife, you must see the magnificent Arabian they have in the stables. The breeding program here is extraordinary. He turned to Theodore and Amelia with a warm smile. Your Graces, I cannot thank you enough for the example you've set. If not for your story, I might never have found the courage to seek a wife through correspondence. And I might never have found the courage to respond, Mrs. Harrison added softly, her eyes never leaving her husband's face. The afternoon passed pleasantly as the two couples shared their stories and experiences. Theodore found himself deeply moved by the obvious affection between the Harrisons and the way they had found in each other exactly what they needed. Not perfection, but understanding and acceptance. You know, Mrs. Harrison said as they prepared to take their leave, we've been thinking about starting a sort of informal network. People who have found happiness through unconventional means, helping others who might be in similar circumstances. What sort of network? Amelia asked, intrigued. Well, we've already heard from several people who read about your story in the newspapers. Widows, spinsters, men who feel themselves unmarriageable for various reasons. Perhaps we could facilitate introductions, offer guidance, share our experiences. Theodore and Amelia exchanged glances, the same thought occurring to both of them simultaneously. We've been doing something similar on a smaller scale, Theodore said slowly. Perhaps it's time to formalize the effort. The Whitmore Foundation for Matrimonial Correspondence, Amelia suggested with a smile. We could establish guidelines, provide a safe way for people to meet, offer support and advice. It's a wonderful idea, Mrs. Harrison said enthusiastically. There are so many lonely people in the world, so many who have given up hope of finding companionship simply because they don't fit society's narrow definitions of desirability. As their guests departed the next morning, Theodore and Amelia stood on the steps of Whitmore Abbey, watching the carriages disappear down the drive. Baby James slept peacefully in Amelia's arms, blissfully unaware of the important decisions being made around him. Are we really going to do this? Theodore asked, slipping his arm around his wife's waist. Start a foundation to help lonely hearts find each other. I think we have to, Amelia replied, leaning into his warmth. We've been given so much. Love, happiness, a beautiful family, a wonderful home. Shouldn't we share that blessing with others? Theodore pressed a kiss to the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender that always clung to her hair. Have I mentioned lately that I love your generous heart? Only every day, Amelia said with a laugh, but I never tire of hearing it. As they turned to go back inside, Theodore caught sight of their reflection in the glass doors. A family, complete and happy, standing in the doorway of a house that had once been a monument to grief, but was now a testament to the power of love to heal and transform. Do you ever regret it? He asked suddenly, responding to that advertisement, taking such a risk with a complete stranger. Amelia paused, considering the question seriously as she always did. Never, she said finally. It was the best decision I ever made. It brought me you, brought me this life. brought me more happiness than I ever dreamed possible. Even knowing what you know now about the challenges we've faced, the gossip, the social difficulties, the times when I've been difficult to live with, especially knowing all of that, Amelia replied firmly. Real love isn't about perfection, Theodore. It's about choosing each other every day, supporting each other through difficulties, growing together rather than apart. We've done that, and we'll continue to do it for the rest of our lives. As they entered the abbey, baby James stirred in his mother's arms, opening his blue eyes to gaze up at his parents with the trusting innocence of a child who has never known anything but love and security. In his small face, Theodore could see the future, not just his son's future, but the future of Whitmore Abbey itself, no longer cursed but blessed, no longer isolated but connected to the world through the bonds of love and service. The Duke, who had sought a wife through letters, had found far more than he had bargained for. He had found redemption, purpose, and a love that had transformed not just his own life, but the lives of countless others who would benefit from the foundation they were about to establish. And in the restored gardens of Whitmore Abbey, where Catherine's roses bloomed alongside Amelia's new plantings, the past and present existed in perfect harmony, a reminder that love, like life itself, could be renewed, transformed, and made beautiful again, no matter how dark the winter that had come before. The curse of Whitmore Abbey was not just broken, it had been replaced by something far more powerful, a legacy of hope, love, and the unshakable belief that everyone, no matter how scarred or lonely, deserved the chance to find their perfect match. This tale reminds us that love often comes when we least expect it, and in forms we never anticipated. Theodore and Amelia's story shows us that true partnership is built not on perfection, but on acceptance, understanding, and the courage to be vulnerable with another person. Their journey from lonely correspondence to lasting love proves that sometimes the greatest risks yield the most precious rewards, and that healing is always possible for those brave enough to open their hearts again.